Participation. Thanks, Sarah. So first of all, I would love if you could just look at this image on the screen and tell me in the chat, what's the first thing that stands out to you in this picture? What do you see? Great. Isabel says there's a lot going on. Okay. Everyone's together. Yeah, lots of people spending some time in a common space. Crying baby. What else? Maybe some holes on the walls, some cockroaches. Awesome. Vanessa is seeing a lot. You picked up on there's a picture on the wall that indicates that maybe they have a faith that's important to their lives. That's great. Thank you. Okay. Oh, we got some more kids playing, some safety concerns. Definitely. Definitely. And there's a ton going on here. But based on that, I'm actually going to launch a poll for us. And it's going to ask you, or am I going to launch a poll? Yes, I can do that. All right. So if you could tell me, what was easier for you to see here? Was it easier to see risk? So maybe dangers, some things that could potentially go wrong, or protective factors, those things that are going well that might be supporting those people in that photo. What's easier for you to see? Sarah, can they see the poll?
Do you want me to end the poll?
Can people see it? That's my question.
I was able to see it.
I can see it.
All right, are results coming in for you? Awesome. When it looks like everyone's responded, can you click end? Because it won't show me responses. Yeah, it won't even show me results. That's unfortunate. Sarah, can you tell us what the results are?
Yeah. So risk factors are easier to see. 45% of people said that. And then 45 also said they were about the same. And then 9% said protective factors are easier to see. So 1 of 11 people said that.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so we're about split on this issue. That's great to hear. Lots of times those risk factors really stand out to everyone. But the reason that we start with this is because it's a really great example of this difference between type 1 and type 2 thinking. So type 1 thinking is our fast, intuitive thought.
You're welcome.
It can sometimes be sort of unconscious. And oftentimes our type 1 thinking is a result of our training and experience. So if we're doing a job every day, we get really good at doing it. We can do a lot of pieces of that job, maybe even without really thinking through what we're doing. And in a lot of our roles, if you work as an educator or if you work in child welfare, for example, sometimes we're trained in those roles to see risk and to assess for risk. So looking for those risk factors can become that type 1 thinking that comes really naturally and unconsciously to us because it's a result of that training. And that's not a bad thing. We want to assess for risk because we want to keep kids safe. But at the same time, it's important that we acknowledge the difference between type 1 and type 2 thinking so that we can slow down, use that type 2 thinking that's more novel. It's built around perceiving variability and really notice all of the things that are going on in a situation rather than defaulting to the things that are easier for us to see as a result of our training. And the reason for that is because when we default to type 1 thinking, that can lead us back to implicit biases because we're sort of acting without consciously noticing what's going into creating our thoughts. Whereas when we slow down and we use our type 2 thinking, we can notice and navigate our biases a lot better. So we start with that, with hope, because one of the goals of hope, healthy outcomes from positive experiences, is to really get everyone to slow down and think a lot more consciously about the strengths that families bring to the table so that we can consciously call those out, celebrate them, and build on them. So we are the Alaska Children's Trust, and I am a certified trainer for the HOPE curriculum. It comes to us from Tufts Medical Center, and it was created by the team there known as the HOPE National Resource Center, which is led by Dr. Robert Segi, who's a pediatrician affiliated with Tufts Medical Center. And it's a pretty big team. They do trainings and technical assistance on this topic all around the country. And feel free to stop me with questions at any time. You can always unmute, or you can put your questions in the chat. Okay, so why does hope exist? Why are we talking about this new framework? Basically, it's an idea that's probably pretty intuitive to all of you, which is that positive experiences are good for kids. They help them be resilient, and they help them ultimately become healthy adults. And what HOPE wants to do is better understand those experiences and support them so that each child can have equitable access to those positive experiences that promote health and well-being. But unfortunately, we know that a lot of systems focus on the negative. A lot of the screening tools that we use, whether it's to screen for ACEs at a pediatrician's office, or whether it's screening when a child is entering a new childcare program, they often focus on finding those risks, which can create a presumption of deficit. We're focusing only on the risk rather than focusing equally on risks and protective factors. What HOPE wants to do is shift that narrative and say, we're all defined by our strengths as much as we are by our challenges. Let's create that presumption that strength exists to create relationships with providers that are based on respect. So that if providers are always assessing for strengths, calling them out and promoting them, we will have these healthier relationships between providers and youth and families that will really promote these healthy experiences. Okay, so before we talk about positive experiences, we are going to talk briefly about adverse childhood experiences. So if you could, in the chat, let me know, how much do you know about adverse childhood experiences? Have you never heard the term before? Would you say you're an expert, or are you somewhere in the middle? Great, Beth says she's very familiar. Awesome, we have some experts in the room. Great. Great. So I'm seeing that most of you, if you're not experts, you're at least familiar. So I'm going to cover this relatively quickly because I don't want to repeat information that you already know, but it is important that we talk about it so that we can understand the context. Okay. So the first study on ACEs was done in the 1990s by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And they asked adults about 10 experiences that they may have had in childhood. You can think of these experiences as things that happen to a child, so that abuse and neglect category, and things that happen around a child, so that household dysfunction category. And together, these 10 ACEs became the ACEs score. So the number that you'd experience became the score. And what the researchers did was they took that information and they then looked at adult health outcomes. And what they found was that there's a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health challenges, both physical and mental health challenges in adulthood. Meaning the more ACEs that you experience as a child, the more likely you are to experience certain negative health impacts as an adult. So here are just a few of those health outcomes that are associated with ACEs. So we've got everything from injuries, traumatic brain injuries, fractures and burns, mental health impacts like depression. We've got maternal health impacts, disease impacts like cancer and diabetes, and also those more behavior focused impacts like substance misuse. All of these are correlated with ACEs, meaning that the more ACEs an individual experiences, the more likely they are to experience these things as an adult. And what that really taught those researchers is that early childhood trauma can have lasting impacts. So here in Alaska, we've also done research on how many ACEs our population has experienced. About 36% of Alaskan adults report experiencing no adverse childhood experiences. That's great. About 17% report experiencing 4 or more. So that's considered that high risk category. And compared to other states, that high risk category, we have a larger population than other states. So compared to other states, Alaska experiences a particularly high burden of childhood adversity. And looking specifically at some of the health impacts in Alaska, I have 3 indicators that are associated with poor mental health. So reporting inadequate sleep, a diagnosis of depression, and reporting frequent mental distress. And you can see really clearly that dose-response relationship, that the more ACEs an individual reports, the more likely they are to report each of these 3 indicators of poor mental health as an adult. So those health impacts are true in Alaska as well. I think when we talk about ACEs, it's really important that we talk about the broader societal context that makes this true, because ACEs are things that happen within the home and within individual families. But that doesn't mean that the family context is the only context that's important here. It's really important that we consider how our societies and communities shape this reality. And so you can imagine this like a tree. So a tree, to grow healthy and strong and produce flourishing green leaves, it needs to be absorbing good nutrients and lots of water through its roots. So similarly, for our families and therefore our children to thrive, those families need to be supported by communities that have all of the resources and things that they need. But we know that a lot of times, unfortunately, our families are not rooted in those healthy environments. Instead, families live in communities that are experiencing community disruption, maybe because of a natural disaster, or where systems have created a lack of economic mobility, or where there's systemic violence, maybe even poor housing quality. In Alaska, a lot of the times we talk about historical trauma. So looking back to American history and Alaskan history, think about things like Alaska Native boarding schools that took children away from their parents and removed them from their cultures, and where there was rampant abuse. That creates this historical background that makes it harder for communities and families to flourish. And if we think really specifically about the 10 ACEs, a great example here is the ACE of having a close family member who is incarcerated. So we know that in the US, certain populations experience incarceration at disproportionate rates. That means that children in those communities are more likely to experience that adverse childhood experience. So this isn't just about individuals, it's about the whole societal context that we have to look at to really understand why this is true and why individuals experience trauma early in life. Any questions about ACEs or the pair of ACEs tree? Okay. So we're going to switch gears. And we're going to talk about positive childhood experiences. So if you could tell me again in the chat, how much do you know about what we call PCEs? Would you say that you're also an expert? Are you equally familiar with this term as you are with ACEs? or are you less familiar? Great, I'm seeing that folks are less familiar, maybe even they haven't really heard the term before. And some are equally familiar, which is also great. So it makes sense to me that some of you would be a little bit less familiar because the research on positive childhood experiences is a little bit newer, and we're still building the research base on this. Whereas with ACEs at this point, going back to the 90s, we have tons of studies in many different contexts on ACEs. We don't have quite as much research on positive childhood experiences. Okay, so before we start talking about this research, I want you all to take a moment and think back to your own childhood. Think of a really positive memory that stands out to you and hold it in your mind as we talk. And we'll return to it later. Okay. So, the research that the HOPE team uses on positive childhood experiences comes from a study that they did in Wisconsin in 2015. So what the HOPE team did was they partnered with the Wisconsin Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, which is a telephone survey of adults. And they added questions about positive childhood experiences to that study. The great thing was that that study was already asking questions about ACEs. So we were able to ask questions both about ACEs and PCEs, and then correlate both with the questions that they were also asking those adults about mental health outcomes. And this is how they developed the positive childhood experiences score. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, what did they ask them about positive experiences? They asked 7 questions. They're here for you on the screen. But basically, they break down into questions about connection. Do you feel like you were connected to your family, to your community, to your friends, to non-parent adults, and then feeling a sense of safety and belonging? So this is specifically what they asked them. And what they found was really interesting. So what the researchers found was that the more positive childhood experiences an adult could report, the more likely they were to also report good mental health as an adult. And that's those who are not reporting depression or frequent mental distress. We call that reporting good mental health. So for those who recalled only 0 to 2 positive experiences, only about half of them reported good mental health. That goes up to a vast majority, 87%, when we look at the category of folks who recalled a lot of PCE slides. So yeah, I'm going to go back to this slide one more time so that you can all see the questions again. So again, this is what they asked related to that. And then they correlated that with adult mental health. So even potentially more interesting than that is they were also able to look at how ACEs factors into this. So here we have the population of people who answered the survey broken down by ACEs score. So the blue line at the bottom is individuals who report no ACEs, whereas the yellow line is individuals who reported 4 to 8 ACEs. So that's a very high risk population. And we can see the difference in mental health outcomes. So for those reporting 0 to 2 positive childhood experiences, the ones who had not experienced a lot of ACEs, only 12% of them reported depression or poor mental health. Whereas the category that had experienced a lot of ACEs and no positive childhood experiences, 60% of them, so a majority, reported poor mental health or depression. But now, if we look at the group who experienced a lot of positive childhood experiences, we can see that that gap has closed. So of the individuals who reported both a lot of ACEs and a lot of positive childhood experiences, only 21% reported depression or poor mental health. So what we're seeing here is that positive childhood experiences are correlated with good mental health, regardless of an individual's ACE score. And that's really good news. That means that those positive childhood experiences might act as that resilience or buffer against the negative health impacts of ACEs for individuals who are in that high risk group and have experienced a lot of childhood trauma. And as the slide says, they might even buffer against the effects of toxic stress. We have research since then that actually indicates that an absence of positive childhood experiences can be more damaging to long-term health outcomes than the presence of ACE. And I do want to point out that the HOPE team is still investigating this. So this original study was done in Wisconsin. And so it was generally a pretty small sample size. It was also a heavily white sample size just because of the state. And so they're expanding this research to 5 more states to back this up and hopefully correlate the research not just with mental health impacts like we're seeing here, but also investigate what positive childhood experiences do for physical health impacts as well. Any questions about any of that research? Great. So why is this true? How do positive childhood experiences protect adult mental health? The important thing here is to understand how toxic stress impacts the body. So when we experience childhood trauma, that can lead to toxic stress. And that's when the brain endures repeated, prolonged exposure to stress or danger. So for those of you in Alaska, I know we have some Washington State folks. I don't know about your animal population, but if you're in Alaska, think about a moose and think about what you experience in your body when you see a moose and it looks like it might charge you. You're probably experiencing a lot of physical sensation in your bodies, right? Your heart rate might start going, you might start sweating a lot more, you might feel a little bit clammy. That's all of your stress hormones pumping your body up so that you can respond immediately to that danger. That's your fight or flight response kicking in. Now think about what would happen if every time you opened your front door, there might be a moose standing there waiting to charge you immediately. You would probably experience a lot of stress every time you opened your door because you think that moose might be there. So for children who experience things like abuse or neglect, who don't know when they're going to be safe and when they're going to experience danger, that's sort of what that response is like. That's toxic stress. And having stress hormones coursing through your body all the time can actually disrupt bodily function quite a lot. It can impact brain functioning. It can impact the functioning of your digestive system. Those hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, they have that physical impact on your body. But we also know that there's hormones associated with positive experiences that can help reduce those stress hormones. So think about oxytocin, sometimes called the love hormone, but we experience oxytocin, say a woman experiences an increase in oxytocin after giving birth to prepare her to bond with her new baby. We also know that when we experience those positive experiences, that's generally associated with an increase in oxytocin. So that might be one of the mechanisms by which positive childhood experiences can decrease those stress hormones, because that's what oxytocin does in part, and help keep us healthy. But there's a lot of research that the HOPE team is doing and pediatricians like Dr. Segi to really understand how this works at a physical level. I think it's more important for a lot of providers just to understand that we know that it's correlated with good health outcomes And also that positive experiences make kids happy and they make families happy. So they're a good thing to do, regardless of what these health effects physically on the body are that we don't quite understand yet. Any questions about any of the science of ACEs or PCEs before we move on and talk about the HOPE framework in a little more detail? Great. Okay, so I showed you those 7 questions that they asked about positive childhood experiences on the Wisconsin study. But what the HOPE team wanted to do was break down positive childhood experiences into these big categories so that we could talk across a lot of contexts about what these experiences look like and how we can promote them in kids' lives. And so to do that, the HOPE team reviewed all the research that had been done on positive childhood experiences to date. And they broke these experiences down generally into these 4 big categories, which they call the 4 building blocks of HOPE, that are really crucial positive experiences that every child needs and that promote those good, healthy outcomes and promote resilience. And we'll go through them one by one. So the first is relationships. Kids need safe, supportive relationships with children and adults. That's family members, but also having those non-parent adult connections is really important. There was a question about that in the chat, and that's a really great question. And those types of adult relationships are very important to youth. There's been a lot of studies on the impacts of mentorship and other things like that to promote healthy outcomes for youth. Okay, so thinking about how this applies to what you all do, how do you promote access to positive relationships for youth in your work? I'd love if you could share an example in the chat, or if you want, feel free to unmute and tell us a little bit about how you do this.
I can go if you want.
Yes, please. Thank you.
So I'm a school counselor, and so obviously my job is promoting positive relationships, but I'm also trying to teach the kids like, positive relationships and how to manage, do conflict resolution and what do healthy relationships look like, and trying to help the teachers build a positive relationship with the kids as well.
Thank you. Yeah, promoting those peer-to-peer relationships and also those teacher-student relationships. Any other thoughts?
Hi, this is Jamie with Alaska Center for Pediatrics. Sorry, my audio's not working on my computer, but I wanted to share our clinic has kind of an applique of this big tree on one of our walls that's pretty prominent for families, and we call it our community. And so we pose different questions each month. And so, for example, the question this month is, what's your favorite thing to do together as a family? And then we have little leaves that the families can then write their activity on and then put it up on the tree for the month. So, I mean, we have everything from, baking cookies to looking through photos together to, it just goes, the list go on and on. So that's a fun thing to see.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and that's a great way to build some of this assessing for strengths into your clinical environment. I love that. I'm seeing at Thread using the Strengthening Families Protective Factors, coaching, training, and wellness resources as well. That's all amazing. One thing I have heard from lots of providers that I love is thinking really critically about the types of relationships that matter to the youth that they serve. So, for example, we know in Alaska, especially, we have a lot of grandparents raising grandchildren. So making sure that our resources are tailored to the types of relationships, maybe those grandparent-grandchild relationships that are really important to youth in our communities. Isabel, I love that example about partnering to co-mentor students and develop projects with students. That definitely counts. That's a great way to develop some healthy relationships. Okay, so moving on to our next building block, which is safe, equitable, stable environments for learning, playing, and living at home and at school. You can think of this building block sort of as the fundamentals building block. Kids need safety and security in order to thrive. And so we need to provide them with those safe, equitable, and stable environments. Any examples of how you promote access to those types of environments in your work?
So I work as a case manager. I'm transitioning out of that job into that family support. So this is very interesting to me. But I think that the case management piece is all about finding like stable housing for families, and not only just getting them into housing, but something that they can sustain on their own.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great example of that basic need that we have to meet for families. And I did this training once for a group that worked with some homeless families, and they talked about the importance of having safe and healthy play areas in housing for homeless families to think about those needs that we are meeting for children. So making sure that we're having those child safe and child-focused spaces in our housing. Any other examples of how you provide access to these environments?
We're still pretty new in our programming, but we've made it a point to make sure any of our events or pop-up museum events that we have going on are free and easy for people to come to, just because that cost point is a barrier for a lot of families.
Thank you, Brennan. Yeah, and that really ties into this equitable piece, that we need these environments to be equitable as well, so that all types of kids and families can access them. And if cost is a barrier, that's really not equitable. We're not making this environment and this positive experience available to all kids. It can be helpful to think of that from a systemic perspective too, in terms of looking at your community. Where is the community building common spaces like playgrounds? Can all families physically get to those spaces? Can all families access them in terms of cost, in terms of geography? Those are great things to assess when we're assessing whether we're creating these experiences for all children or just for a few. Any other examples of environments? Do any of you promote access to nature or natural environments in your work?
Yes, I took a bunch of kiddos on a trail hike yesterday. We're going birch tapping next week. We're going across the bay. Very important.
Awesome. Sierra, can I ask you a follow-up? Can you talk a little bit about why you think that's so important for the kids in your program?
A lot of the kids that we serve don't have the financial ability to sign up for maybe more expensive outdoor summer programming. And so going back to that equity piece and providing that experience to all youth, especially in Homer, it's expensive to get across the bay. So we try to facilitate that. And it's important for teens to form connection with nature because I'm a hippie, but also because it's good for their mental health, reducing depression, those tactile experiences. I mean, yesterday it was so cute. Like one of the kids just started storytelling and narrating our trail hike in this fantasy voice, and there was imagination happening and creativity and just learning, to get outside of their bubble and feel the sun on their skin.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm seeing Amanda put in the chat that at her organization, WorldCap, they're teaching families in Head Start how to use hydroponics to grow fresh fruits and fresh vegetables. that's an awesome way to create some really healthy environments. So thank you for that example too. You all are doing a ton, it sounds like, to promote access to these environments. So the third building block is engagement, social and civic engagement to develop a sense of belonging and connectedness. Sometimes this building block sounds a little bit nebulous to folks because kids don't vote. How are they engaged civically? But really all this comes down to is how we create spaces and ways for kids to feel connected to their communities and like they belong in their communities. And we can define community in so many ways. So it might be the village where a child lives, but it could also be the school as a community. An after school program could be a community where a child feels a sense of belonging, connectedness, and where they're doing that giving back. So I'd love to hear some examples of this as well. What are some ways in which you promote access to that type of civic engagement and belonging and connectedness in your work?
As we're developing out our programs and reaching out to our community, we're making sure to include kids in our listening sessions and asking for input from kids of all ages, just so they feel a bit of ownership about what we're doing.
I love that so much, Brennan. Thanks. Yeah. Child and family advisory groups or listening sessions can be an amazing way to really integrate this into programming and make kids feel like they have a stake in what they're participating in. After school programs have told me that they do this as well when they're deciding what programming they're going to put on, that they involve the kids in that process, and it really helps them feel even more connected to the programming. Any other examples? I see Maureen put in the chat Project Citizen and Youth Court. Yeah, youth courts are an amazing way to do this. I think there's also really simple ways that we can promote this. So getting kids involved in community traditions, whether that's an annual parade or another type of holiday celebration, any sort of volunteering in the community to give back can be an amazing way to promote some of that civic engagement because that type of giving back really helps kids feel like they have a stake in their community. And then the last building block is emotional growth. So we can think of this sort of as the social and emotional learning, the SEL building block. But kids really need that space to play and interact with peers to gain self-awareness and learn to self-regulate. And I think it's really important here that we also give kids time to do this in a less regulated setting, so that unstructured play is especially important to this emotional growth piece. A lot of times providers tell me like, well, when they're watching kids play, oftentimes it looks more like the kids are just fighting about the rules and never actually get to playing the game. But that rule creation process is doing that emotional growth. Kids are figuring out big concepts like what's fairness and how is that actualized in their world when they're doing activities like that. So any examples about how you provide those access, those opportunities for emotional growth in your work?
Sorry, it's me again. So it's kind of at the root of what we're doing is we provide opportunities for unstructured play as well as some guided activities and things that kids can bounce off of when we're doing all of our events and things. So we might have hands-on activities with rules that they have to follow, but then we also have like unstructured playtime, or just I like to take a bag of toys and dump them out and let the kids just start working together to figure them out.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that you're providing those different types of opportunities, whether it's with structure or a little bit more unstructured. Okay, so if we go back to our 4 building blocks put together, we have relationships, environments, engagement, and emotional growth. So if you can think back to that positive experience from your own childhood that you thought of when we started talking about PCEs, I would love if you could tell me what category or which categories, because it might cross boundaries between these 4, you think your experience falls into. Isabel says relationships and engagement. And if you want to share what that experience was that came to mind, we'd love to hear that too. Great, Sierra says engagement. Maureen, a trusted friend, relational, thank you. Anyone want to be brave and come off mute and tell us what that experience that you thought of was and a little bit about which building blocks it relates to?
As a teen, I was able to get involved with the local domestic violence and women's shelter in Dutch Harbor called USAFE, and I was a volunteer there and was able to meet a lot of really incredible people that made me feel supported. My mom also worked there, so it was cool for me as a kid to see my mom involved in that work and get involved and build relationships and be a part of community activities and events. I definitely felt really connected to my community and saw impacts of things that I did with my peers. So I really loved that.
Thanks, Sierra. Yeah, and that seems like a really great example of how most of our experiences cross boundaries between these building blocks. It sounds like you got some opportunities for civic engagement through that, but also built some really strong relationships and maybe experienced some emotional growth. So it's really hitting probably on all of the building blocks, and that's pretty common. We can often create all 4 of these types of experiences at the same time for youth. We don't have to think of them. Yeah, it's different. They're definitely intersectional, like Sierra says in the chat. So the other reason why it's really important to talk about ACEs and PCEs together is because one of the things that adverse childhood experiences do is they not only are traumatic in and of themselves, but they disrupt our ability to access positive experiences. So think about child abuse and neglect. When a child experiences that, it disrupts their relationships, especially if that's abuse happening in the home. That foundational relationship with a parent or a caregiver has been fundamentally disrupted. And oftentimes abuse and neglect also disrupts safe environments because the child might not feel safe at home, or if the child is removed from the home as a result of child abuse and neglect, even if that's done for safety, that can be a huge disruption in a child's life. If we think about family disruption, so something like experiencing homelessness or having to move because of a natural disaster, or even because of the impacts of climate change, that again disrupts safe environments. It can disrupt the child's access to their home, to their community. And then think about adverse community environments. So that could look like growing up in a community where violence on the street is really common. That disrupts, again, access to safe environments, but it can also reduce opportunities for civic engagement. So if a parent doesn't feel like the community is safe, they're much less likely to take their child out to community events or to go volunteer in the community, or even just go to a playground and have time engaging in those emotional growth opportunities. So one of the things that I would encourage you all to do as providers, if you're seeing kids who've experienced trauma, is thinking really critically about what positive experiences they've lost access to as a result of that trauma. And then think about the ways that you can add back in those experiences in other settings. So just because a child, say, loses access to a safe and caring adult because of child abuse, that doesn't mean that that child will never have positive, healthy relationships. It just means we need to work a little bit harder to make sure that those relationships are fostered in other settings. So when we can assess what kids are missing as a result of trauma, we can critically look and add back in those experiences in other areas. And that's one of the benefits of using the HOPE framework. Any questions about that? Okay. So the other important thing about positive childhood experiences that I want to end on today is that these experiences are community defined. So what communities value and what they see as positive and healthy might differ from community to community based on culture, location, available resources, or other things. So some communities and some cultures really highly value those extended family relationships. And in some communities, it's really common for kids to grow up living in a home that has a lot of extended family relatives. In other communities, that's much less common. And so the types of relationships that it would be important to support for children who live in two communities might differ based on whether those types of multi-generational households are really common or maybe a little bit less common. So I would love for us to think a little bit about how the communities that we live in define those building blocks, and whether you can think of specific things that your community values when it comes to these building blocks that's based on the specific dynamics of the community that you live in. Does anyone have an example of how their community's unique factors shape what experiences families value? Awesome. Maureen put in the chat valuing elders, neighbors, pets, and nature. That's amazing. Yeah. So it's a really great one because I definitely did not grow up. I grew up in Connecticut. My community didn't really place a high value on relationships with elders. And yet I've come to Alaska and I've learned and been able to visit a lot of communities where that's extremely important. And have seen how highly valued those connections are. So it's important that we call out those types of relationships as being important to our communities so that we can actively help support them. Because if we can't name them, we can't support them. Any other examples of the things that you've noticed your community's family and youth really value in terms of positive experiences? Nature, I think, can be a great example. What communities value in terms of access to nature and what that looks like can depend a lot on the dynamics of that community. So that might look like access to subsistence activities in a community where that's really important and is an integral part of life. So in communities with subsistence practices, creating environments that give all children access to those practices is a really crucial positive experience. Whereas it might not be as important in communities where that's not a big part of everyday life. And then one of the things that I'll end with here is that it, like Brennan says in the chat, it's really hard sometimes to know what the community values in terms of these experiences. So the other thing that I would encourage you to think about is how you as a provider can get to know what your community values when it comes to these positive experiences. What types of relationships do kids care about? What types of relationships matter most in their lives? That's something that you could find out through many different formats. You could find that out just by observing the kids in your program and who they talk about, and who they interact with. It's also something that you could ask them explicitly, you know, who is a trusted adult in your life that really matters to you is a question that might give you some insight into that. So there's definitely ways in which we can all work to make sure that we're asking good questions and not relying on assumptions when it comes to making sure that we really understand what positive childhood experiences our communities value. Because when it comes to creating these experiences, if we're not creating experiences that the community has already identified as positive, there's not going to be high engagement and they're not going to be received as positive by the community. So these have to be things that have been identified by the individuals themselves as being of value, so that we're really adding that value and not just assuming that we know what communities need. So our main takeaway and Hope's main takeaway really is just that adversity is not destiny. Positive childhood experiences are a great, really impactful and super easy way to help children who've experienced large amounts of adversity and trauma early in life thrive and flourish. We know that through the research. I think as providers, you all probably know that intuitively as well. This can seem really simple, but we can make it more complex and we can make it even more meaningful to our communities when we do that work of assessing what types of experiences are really important to the families and communities that we're serving, and really working to understand how they define those positive childhood experiences. So thank you so much. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has about Hope. This was a more abridged version of the Hope framework. We do a 90-minute training that gets into assessing organizations a little bit more in depth. So if you're interested really in working through some of those issues at the organizational level about how you can promote access to these experiences, we do offer those trainings for free, and you can always reach out to me. And then I do have a QR code link to a really short survey that you can take just to let us know what you thought of this training, and I would really appreciate that.